Something strange is being spotted in our national forests and state parks. In fact, even the indigenous tribes have spoken about it for centuries. Explorers and fur trappers in the 1800s encountered it, and now there could be multiple deaths attached to it. The truth is far more disturbing than you'll ever know. You won't want to miss this one. On Saturday, December 2nd, 2017, Mark was walking along the Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park in the Stout Memorial Grove. This grove is approximately 1 mile in total circumference. Mark was planning to circle around to the left, but two young men started to walk off trail towards a larger tree, so Mark decided that he was going to go ahead to the right instead, not thinking anything of it. And then, just 50 feet down the trail, Mark heard this loud roar mixed with two screams, and then dead silence. Now at first, Mark thought it was just the two guys messing around, but he didn't hear any laughter after it. Not to mention, it just seemed too unnaturally quiet. And so the hair on his arm stood up, wondering what it was. But he just has this really bad feeling in the pit of his stomach, and he just made the decision to go ahead and turn around and immediately leave. Now, right at this time, it was roughly about 6:40 p.m. in the evening, and the sun was just starting to set in the sky. And so Mark is going to go ahead and go back down the same way he came, and not even more than 20 feet away, he notices something that catches his attention off the trail. Now, Mark looks in that direction, and he could clearly see this black figure that is standing no more than 120 feet from where the two young guys were standing earlier. So he starts looking, and he's thinking to himself that this has to be a bear standing up because it's roughly 7 feet tall and was also backlit by the sun. Unfortunately, the face was partially obscured by a branch, and because of the distance, he couldn't exactly make out every single detail. However, thinking quickly, he decided to pull out his phone and snap a couple of pictures. But it's not like he sat there trying to do a whole photo shoot, he just snapped a few and walked away. Now, I think for Mark, he didn't really realize what it was that he took a picture of, or maybe just didn't think too much of it, because it wasn't until later on, as he was looking at these pictures, that they had kind of took him off guard just because of how strange they looked. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think it was a coincidence that this animal he took a picture of just happened to be in the right place at the right time where he heard the strange noises and all the creepy roaring sounds. And Mark really never came forward and claimed that he had photographic evidence of a creature, a monster, or anything like that. In fact, he was pretty much just like, hey, I had this weird picture, I can't explain it, and I also had these weird experiences in the Redwood State Park. I really don't know what to make of it. So this question goes out to all of you watching. What do you think this was? Unfortunately, the identity of this strange unknown animal remains inconclusive. Back in 2016, in the Boise National Forest, Finn and his mother were driving home from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, late one winter night. And this was right after the first snow. Now, to get to their house, you have to cross the train tracks twice. And so as they were passing the Looney House, a house we'll get to in just a moment, around 10 or so p.m. with clear vision, something happened. Now, there's a bullpine tree line to the right and a hillside to the left, with Finn's property straight on top of a hill. Finn's brights were on, and he was basically just scanning the tree line as they were making their way and passing. And then Finn noticed something off in the tree line that caused him to land in the ditch next to the road. It shocked him so badly. Now, what on God's green earth would these be from? Because these were incredibly large. And so he just starts following them because he sees they go from tree to tree, and he would actually follow them quite a ways down the trail, and what he would find would shock him. He could see what appeared to be the largest canine prints he'd ever seen in his entire life, and in the same area, he also easily discovered one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire story: a deer carcass that had no head, no organs, or any hindquarters left. And as he comes across this, it is very odd and out of place, and he begins looking around and just investigating, only to find that the neck bone was actually crumbled and shattered, and he could see that all the flesh around was torn and just ripped, clearly with intense physical force. Something just destroyed this deer, and as he starts looking at the ribs, he could clearly see that they were separated in a pattern that could only allude to hyperextension. But wait, folks, what he discovered gets more and more disturbing. And as he's taking in all the carnage and just looking at this ghastly scene of slaughter, all these thoughts just start racing in his mind of why this isn't matching up with the typical coyote kill, despite there being several coyote tracks around him in the snow. And the first big, or maybe I should say the first strange thing, is that it's not really like coyotes to ever leave behind back straps and breast meat. However, when Finn looked over and up at this tree, what he saw just completely left him baffled. One of the ripped off legs of the deer was actually wedged in the fork of this thin pine tree, roughly about 12 feet off the ground. The problem with this is that this tree was so flimsy that it wouldn't even be able to support the weight of a bobcat. Clearly, there was some sort of alpha predator in this area that was causing carnage and had torn this deer apart, and Finn just felt lucky that he wasn't there to face it himself. Now, the actual thing that he saw that snowy evening was what he would describe as being 12 to 14 feet tall, massive, shadowy, large perched ears, and glowing eyes. And later on that evening, when he and his mother were hearing those strange howling sounds, he would eventually reach out to a man by the name of Vic Cundiff, who runs the popular Dogman Encounters podcast, just seeking any answers he could. Now, what I find very interesting is that Finn and his mother are actually firm believers in the supernatural and paranormal and cryptids, and they're even both members of the BFRO. And do you guys remember earlier in the story when I mentioned the Looney House? Well, these are their neighbors who have these bizarre signs that they hang up about giants in the woods and government cover-ups and even the hoodoo legend of the Howler. However, they never in a million years suspected, well, Finn at least would suspect he would see what many people refer to as a dogman. Since this all happened, Finn has not returned to the woods behind his house, at least without ever going armed. Now, funny enough, his neighbors now think he's absolutely crazy because every time he goes out there, he's in full combat gear and he's setting up trail cams to try and capture something. Now, although he hasn't seen anything since, there are some other weird things going on in his neighborhood that make him wonder. Now, right across the street from where he lives, there's this older rancher that he had the chance to speak to, and this is a guy who firmly believes that a grizzly bear is attacking, mauling, and just devouring his cows. And every neighbor that Finn has spoken to in the area has also heard the howling. And probably the most unsettling thing of all, at some point after this, as Finn was trying to dig for more answers, he got a chance to go and speak to his landlord. And so he just began questioning this guy and asking him while on that property had he ever seen or heard anything while being there. And his landlord, I guess, just clammed up really quick. His face turned pale white as a ghost, and he didn't really want to talk about it for some reason. Unfortunately, with nothing conclusive as to what it was that Finn saw that evening and the strange and just bizarre circumstances surrounding the events during and afterwards, it all remains unsolved. Years ago, around 2010, Noah was living in northern Los Angeles, California. And at this time, there was this newer development happening called Azusa, which is basically right near the hills, and it kind of has a canyon running right through it. Now, because it was a newer development, there were newer homes being built during this time, and to add more of the creep factor to everything, this area is actually just outside the Angeles National Forest border north of LA. And on this particular day, Noah was actually driving out to attend a commercial premiere that featured his son. And it just so happened to be taking place in Azusa. And as they got there in the evening, they couldn't really find any available parking because, remember, there was construction and development going on, and so obviously you would just try to have to find and park wherever you could. And they eventually had to park across the street in kind of this business complex. And also where they were, there were these awnings on the building next to them, and it was very well lit, so they could really see everything quite well. Now, this does come into play here in a minute. And so after the premiere happens and they end up staying there for just a few hours chatting away and socializing, and it's roughly probably about 6 p.m. or so in the evening, Noah and his son begin heading back towards the car. And so Noah actually goes to the passenger side first to let his son in. And as his son is getting into the vehicle, both Noah and his son notice something that's very much out of place. And so as Noah and his son, they could see this really large animal that's running northbound towards the street and passing right in front of their vehicle. Now, they only saw it because of just how well lit this area was, and they saw what appeared to be this large black dog, except it was bigger than any dog they'd ever seen and moving faster than any dog they've ever thought possible. And so Noah freaks out, immediately yells at his son to get in the car now. We got to get out of here. And without ever taking his eyes off of this thing, he just runs around to the driver's side of the vehicle, throws his door open, and jumps in. However, what happens next is completely terrifying. And I honestly probably would have had a heart attack on the spot. As Noah is climbing into the driver's seat and getting ready to slam his door on this thing, this big dog-like animal stops abruptly, turns its head to look directly at them, and so for the first time, they get a pretty good look at what they were seeing. And Noah could see that this animal had a man's head attached to its body, but that its eyes were glowing this bright red. And without ever taking their eyes off of this thing, Noah just quickly turned the car on, flew out of there faster than he's ever driven before. Now, clearly, Noah has no way to ever describe what he encountered, nor does his son, but they've never spoken about it since this happened. So if this thing that Noah and his son saw was running northbound, is it possible that it was running back in the direction of the national forest, maybe where it resides? I mean, it's hard to say for sure because we can only go by what little information we have. But interestingly, a very similar being was spotted up at a state park way north years later. Because on August 27th, 2016, Greg was with his 10-year-old grandson who was sitting in a car at a restaurant parking lot waiting for his paternal grandmother. And now, across the street from him on a sidewalk, the grandson noticed this large creature walking on two legs towards a wooded area at the end of the sidewalk. And so the grandson watched as this thing disappeared into some brush, and now not only did it disappear, but it didn't seem concerned about being seen by the grandson, like it was a no hurry. And so the grandson completely freaks out about what he saw and begins describing his experience to his grandfather and really telling him what it was. Now, something that's really interesting is that this particular area is really considered part of the Big Basin's Redwoods State Park, which, for those that don't know, already has a bunch of strange supposed Bigfoot sightings in and around the area. And in fact, the entire state of California, and well, this just might be because there's a lot of people, but there are a very high number of reports of strange and supernatural things. I'm not talking about just UFOs. I'm not talking about just Bigfoot sightings, but everything from supposed shapeshifters and reptilians to even seeing portals. And so when Greg began asking his grandson more questions, like could he elaborate more on what it was he'd seen, his grandson began to describe this almost werewolf-like being with red eyes. And at the time, the grandson was only maybe like 30 feet away or so from this thing, and it supposedly only lasted a handful of seconds. Now, given its overall physique and height, it is highly unlikely that this was a simple misidentification, as no animals bear a similar appearance. Interestingly, what Greg's 10-year-old grandson described was the typical canine type of dogman, or I think type 1. Now, there are actually several, I think there's actually 7 different types of these dogs that people report seeing, and the most common is the type 1, where they see this humanoid that is jet black in color and has large rippling muscles with an exaggerated build, glowing red eyes, and ears perched on its head. Now, something else to note is that this area, specifically Daly City, is pretty semi-rural, and there are large pockets of woodlands and several forests dotting the area. Now, as far as the mysterious werewolf-looking being that Noah and his son, Greg and his grandson all saw at different times and places, it all remains a mystery. Right near the Willamette National Forest, just outside of Albany, Oregon, in the early morning hours of March 2017, Louisa was having trouble sleeping due to her severe back pain, a symptom of her fibromyalgia. Now, it was 2:30 in the morning, and she was lying on her side, reading, when suddenly her very close neighbor's motion detector light turned on, illuminating the entire side of her house. Now, this happens from time to time, but in the 9 years they've lived there, Louisa has never once seen anything walk past her bedroom window at night. So she's thinking that this is odd and decides to go and investigate. Big mistake, right? Well, what she saw just outside her window had massive shoulders and a massive head. And speaking of the head, she could see ears that were distinctly those of a German Shepherd, and what appeared to be a long snout. And even in this brief experience, she was able to tell that the mouth was slightly open and could even see a large tongue that was kind of lolling to the side. And as she exclaimed out of shock, this thing actually kind of slowed down, turned in her direction, and almost kind of smirked at her, but just kept going. Now, I think it's safe to say that she probably didn't sleep well that night at all. For Louisa, this experience amazed her more than it frightened her, but she was also no stranger to these sorts of beings, as she called them. Now, fast forward to the future, and Louisa was once again in her bedroom when she heard the sound that completely startled her. She could hear something huge landing on the ground right behind her bedroom wall. Now, I need to note here that this wall behind her has no windows, so obviously she couldn't see anything, but she can hear whatever is moving around and making this deep, raspy breathing. It was extremely terrifying, and Louisa could do nothing but just sit there and pray and plead the blood of Jesus for protection. And so after that, it just kind of seemed to go quiet and disappear altogether. And she decided to keep this experience quiet for some time until maybe a couple of weeks later, when she would finally gather the courage to tell her husband about it. Well, he did take her seriously, and he went outside to the area in which she saw this thing, and he actually took measurements. And whatever this thing was that she saw for the first time, it had to have been at least 8 feet tall. And both experiences have spooked her enough that she will not even try to walk outside at night anymore. And she feels that it's really not safe. And she's actually gone around and attempted to caution her neighbors to be extremely careful going out at night. Just try to avoid it if they can altogether. Now, the area in which she lives appears to be a prime habitat for whatever animal this is. This is a manufactured home community, and even nearby, there's lots of trees, lots of foliage, lots of coverage, and it's got very close canals and waterways and woods and large open fields and rivers. I mean, this is perfect. Now, interestingly, to add to Luisa's story is that years ago, supposedly there was a homeless woman who had been camping down by a river nearby in Albany, Oregon, and not only was she found dead, but she had been torn to pieces, and her tent was completely ripped to shreds as well. Apparently, nobody was ever caught for that particular crime. Also in that same area was a couple who supposedly saw a similar creature to the one that Luisa had seen, and it had completely terrified them. The mysterious creature that was outside her home, the beast that mauled the woman to death, and the creature that the couple saw in the same area all remain a mystery. In the fall of 1997, within the boundaries of Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, Tabitha and her mother were driving home to Snohomish from Sultan, which are two towns that are roughly 15 miles apart. Well, they had just dropped off a friend in Sultan, and it was late October. And on this particular evening, it was very stormy. There was a lot of lightning and wind. And this storm, by the way, was very unusual. There was a ton of lightning, a very cold, dry wind with no rain, and very loud thunder. It was so unusual that the following day, everybody was talking about it. But we'll get into that in a moment. Now, after dropping off this friend, they were on a stretch of road that's very dark with farmland on either side, Highway 2, and both sides having densely wooded hills and such. And so Tabitha and her mother are in her little 1991 Honda Accord when something catches her eye off to the left side, which appears to be in a farm field. Now, before we go further, directly to the left of the vehicle was a guardrail, and up ahead, there was a break in this guardrail that allowed a dirt road to go directly into the field. And as Tabitha is coming up to this, she could clearly see this huge dog that is running up and appears right in front of her car, and bam, she hits this thing dead on. And as soon as they make an impact with this thing, the most bizarre thing happens. Tabitha and her mother clearly felt the impact, but it is as if it just mysteriously vanished. They did not see it go above the car. They did not see it go either to the left or right. And it wasn't like they just imagined this. I mean, as soon as Tabitha hit this thing, it caused her entire car to swerve back and forth into the oncoming lane of traffic. I mean, it's not like she's hitting this thing with a huge lifted truck. I don't know if any of you out there know just how dainty and tiny these little things are, but they're basically death traps waiting to happen. And so she's very fortunate enough that she's able to regain control of the vehicle, nearly avoiding a head-on collision with the van coming right up to her in her direction. And so as she regains control of the vehicle, she starts to look around, and that's when she notices that this thing isn't anywhere around, but yet They clearly hit this thing. And just from the experience alone, she and her mother were so shaken up that she actually had to pull over on the side of the road. And they're both thinking at this point that whatever they hit absolutely had to be somewhere in a ditch on the side of the road, because things don't just vanish into thin air. But Tabitha just had this feeling about this dog that she couldn't quite make sense of. Now, right before the impact, she and her mother were able to get a pretty clear look at this thing. And unlike the creatures that we've discussed in the last 4 stories, this looked quite a bit different. What they saw looked far more reminiscent of a hyena, including the arched back, the spots, and the coloring. Now, she didn't see a hyena, but if we're making the comparison, obviously it looks much closer to that. So once they're able to calm their nerves down and, they're kind of just looking around, and well, they never found it anywhere. And they just decide to go ahead and get back in the car and stop at a small gas station on their first stop in Monroe, which is a town on the way. Also, keep in mind that when Tabitha and her mother got out to inspect the vehicle for any signs of evidence, being on the front of it, like maybe blood or fur, well, there was nothing. There wasn't even a single dent or a scratch, and they were going at a pretty considerable speed. I mean, we're talking 60 miles an hour here. And so the rest of the night, however, just seemed to go on without any other strangeness. But what's interesting is that the following day, Tabitha and her mother, who by the way lived miles apart in completely different directions, kept hearing people talking about this strange storm and just how out of place it was for that location. You have to remember that Seattle is very rainy, it's very wet, and this wasn't the typical thunderstorm that they usually get. And in fact, Seattle and the surrounding area generally experiences these kind of intense storms much less often than you might think. In fact, there's a term used that's called atmospheric rivers, and they are these more powerful thunder and lightning storms that can move into the area and bring with them narrow bands of moisture and strong winds. But again, they're not common at all. As far as the coincidence of the strange storm that fell that evening, the hyena-ish creature that Tabitha hit with her car, and the fact that it seemed to vanish before their very eyes, it all remains a mystery. Now, for this episode, I just tackled a lot of experiences that resided in the western portion of the United States and around these specific state and national forests. But if you guys enjoyed this episode in particular, I might just continue it with a part 2 and maybe even more than that, and go east with a lot more. Also, special thanks to North American Dogman Project for these eyewitness submissions. And because you guys have made it this far into the episode, I want you all to comment down below unidentified canine. So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy content like this, where I talk about all things mysterious, strange, unexplained, and supernatural, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button for more content just like this. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.